After Bion returned from his war experience in 1919, he went to university studying history and philosophy at Oxford. It was then some 6 or 7 years before he went on to medical school and then eventually to train as a psychoanalyst. At Oxford, he met and became friends with a young philosophy lecturer there. This was H.J. Patton, who later became professor of philosophy at Oxford and a well-known authority on Immanuel Kant. Bion's wife, widow, confirmed that Patton had been one of the big influences in Bion's thinking, and in effect, Bion was partially a Kantian thinker. So I want to draw attention to one aspect of Kant's philosophy, which I think illuminates Bion's approach I'm trying to capture. Kant is complex and an obscure philosopher, and I can't represent much of his thinking. But it looks as if Bion picked up one significant aspect. Kant argued that useful thoughts must be based on both intuition and concepts. In particular, if a thought does not have an intuitive base, then it will be empty, so that it can say nothing. Moreover, an intuition without a solid conceptual basis renders the intuition blind. And it fails to say anything useful about the real world. So this is to quote from Kant, and the English translation, of course: thinking without intuition is empty, and intuition without concepts is blind. Whatever relevance that has, I'm not sure. But Bion seemed to believe that psychoanalysts were not sufficiently aware of the distinction. In his main treatise on this, in 1970, called Attention and Interpretation, he wrote, "We find it necessary to differentiate between the pain of a broken leg and the pain, say, of bereavement." And he tried to explain, I quote from that book, "The physician is dependent on realization of sensuous experience in contrast with the psychoanalyst whose dependence is on experience that is not sensuous. The physician can see and touch and smell. The realizations with which a psychoanalyst deals cannot be seen or touched. Anxiety has no shape or color, smell or sound. For convenience, I propose to use the term intuit as a parallel in the psychoanalyst's domain to the physician's use of see, touch, smell, and hear." This is the kind of distinction that Bion was grasping, trying to grasp, in this later period of his life, and which is central to trying to understand Bion's approach. He expressed a real difference, which we can feel, I think, between a broken bone and a broken heart. We, as psychoanalysts, do not have to rely on the precision of our senses. With intuition, we get a direct empathic contact with another's experience. but at the same time we have a problem to describe it. So Mawson describes intuition in this way: as something swimming into view in the mind. I quote from him, Biona made a distinction between the kind of memory that interferes with analytic receptivity and a different kind, more akin to a sudden recalled dream which swims into view. For this phenomenon, Biona preferred the term evolution. Well, just to clarify, Biona did use the term evolution in the middle of the 1960s, but it is much the same as the term intuition that he used in 1970 in the quotation I've just given. He says psychoanalytic reports may be close to facts. For instance, the process report of he said, I said detail. This can carry meaning, but is remote from observation of the field of actual experience. We can, in fact, record the words, but not the intuitive field of emotional interaction or action, behavior. He says these descriptions are either picturesque inaccuracy or jargon. That's his assessment of his own papers that he gave 10 years before. So this is his fairly pessimistic summary of the tools we have to communicate between analysts. He is a little bit more optimistic when he comes to describe communication with the patient. And again I quote, I do not consider here the varieties of experience with which the hallucinated patient confronts the analyst, but the analyst's experience of the patient's hallucination is usually a good example of what I mean by evolution. At one moment, the facts seem to be a simple outpouring of hostility. Suddenly, they are transformed. The patient is experiencing hallucination, he says. Now, this is his position in the middle of the 1960s, that you have to be very suspicious of these complex theoretical discussions in the literature. He seems to be saying that the central problem is that without being there, we cannot properly grasp the intuitive experience of the analyst who is there, nor of his patient, the patient's experience, the patient being there as well. Now he then commented on in this commentary in the book, he then commented on the psychoanalyst's loneliness. He spots, correctly I think, how he has himself sought this medical model, attempting to know what the patient is. And he reflects back on that report in the original paper, when he knew better than the patient and better than the family, which is a common state of mind for a new analyst, any analyst. As psychoanalyst, I was committed, he's saying in this critical judgment, as psychoanalyst, I was committed to keeping an open mind, while feeling constant pressure, not least from myself, to take refuge in certainty. It is right to point out that the exclusion of both memory and desire exposes the analyst to the anxiety of being in a minority of one. he is the only person, he is the only analyst who was there in that session with that patient. So he's saying that the refuge from loneliness is the comfort of having a memory of theories and all sorts of thoughts, and the hope of having a cure. That, he's saying, is a kind of defense against this loneliness of the intuition that you get from being the one person who's had the experience. He tries very hard to get across this problem of conveying the experience of being there. So he described in the commentary an extraordinary situation, quoting him, as if the analyst had a skin that floated off him and now occupied some position between the analyst and the patient. Well, this is, I believe, an attempt to evoke in the reader an intuition that evolved in the psychoanalyst at the time. Has he succeeded, I wonder, in evoking something in the reader? The experience of one's skin floating off does not immediately evoke an intuition in me, I thought. And in fact, Bion was unhappy anyway, as he had to resort to a bodily, sensuous image to express something completely immaterial. He has to use the image, the metaphor, as the only way of conveying the evolution of experience, which he has defined as the crux of the matter. And he knew it was inadequate. So this commentary in the book was considering the difficulties of communication between analysts. Bion is clear that the kind of communication which is an evolved intuition swimming into view must also be the kind of communication between analysts, and as well as in the analytic situation with the patient. Communication between patient and analyst and between colleague analysts has a kinship with Freud's unconscious to unconscious communication, which had mystified Freud way back in those papers on technique, particularly in 1912, Freud wrote, was it Remembering, Repeating and Working Through, I think is the paper. So Bion published this repudiation of his 1950s work in the commentary of 1967, but he was already setting out a new position with papers on memory and desire and catastrophic change to the British Psychoanalytic Society in 1965. He also discussed a case in the fourth of his seminars in Los Angeles, which I now want to examine. In that case, we're now going to consider, I think he was trying to describe this different approach, which he called O, or becoming or being. And the question is, has he solved the problem of cultivating this kind of intuition, or reverie, as he calls it at this time, for this swimming into view of intuition? And has he, in the process, solved the problem of communicating the indescribable substance of an intuition? Now, this is a patient, a woman of 30 years, who screamed abuse at Bion, starting in the waiting room until the end of the session. Bion gives little of the content of the abuse, but a great deal about the impact on him as a person, and as a person who is an analyst trying to do his job. I picked this patient because it's so unanalytic material. And what is he doing trying to present this kind of material in his seminar? That's the question I'm trying to focus on, and I want to put into your mind. Continued this description in the seminar that he was giving, with little system to his account. It went on for 6 pages, 2,500 words. His account conveyed to the audience an experience of the session, not a detailed process of movement and meaning, as in the case in the 1950s paper. He concentrated on his problem of presenting a session. What he tells his audience is not a replay of what was said. Rather, he gives an account designed to impact on his audience, I think. And I'll quote a bit from this seminar. Now this business went on. The free associations, if that is what you can call them, which were conducted in a shout, turned into free associations which were conducted in a scream. I don't know if there's a further description, but if so, she got there. By this time, she got off the mat. She had a style of communication which isn't very easily described in ordinary English. So instead of the content, and instead of the process, Biona is conveying the impact. Ironically, he referred to this as his recommendation to get rid of your memory and your desire so that you expose yourself to the full treatment, as he called it. The problem was not of being receptive, it was that he simply could not avoid the experience he was subjected to. He goes on conveying his experience. I saw no chance of getting in an interpretation before the end of the session. I felt, quite rightly, as it turns out, confident that I would not be able to give any interpretation which might be of any use to this patient, and that the session would end where one was confronted with the obvious fact of a very serious situation, no analytic work done. And the prospect of any sort of aftermath of it, from suicide to just breaking off of the analysis permanently. Then he continues, I think it was legitimate to say, not metaphorically, but literally, that one began to feel that one couldn't hear oneself think. So that the communication which was destroyed, the link which was destroyed, was coming close to being a link that one had with oneself. Well, Biona is not just offloading a feeling of frustration, I think. He was trying to make a move. The move is from K to O, I think. It's not an attempt at an account of a sensuous experience, as Biona might call it. If he had described the content and the process of the associations and interpretations, he's not trying to describe what he heard with his ear. He is trying to discover a move to a non-sensuous experience one in which he conveys the impact on him. And in particular, he is exploring what it means to make a presentation in the form of his own experience, not as a scientist might present, using standard abstract constructions and notation. It looks to me as if he's trying to demonstrate rather than describe what it means to aim towards O, the intuitive being with the patient,